Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to our session here. Thank you for coming right after lunch to Open Source Summit for our session on the sustainability of open source projects, commercial and community. I'm Andrew Sullivan. I am product manager for Wind River Linux and Elixir Pro at Wind River. Come check out our booth. I am here hosting this amazing panel of open source contributors and experts from ARM, Intel, and Wind River. And I'll introduce our three panelists right now, and I've got some questions, and then we would love to take questions from you as well. So without further ado, at my right, we have Megan Knight from ARM, Senior Director of Software Communities. Is that right?
Pretty close.
Pretty close, okay.
It's the gist.
Yes. After Megan, we have Catherine Druckman, Open Source Evangelist from Intel.
That is correct.
That is correct. And at my far right, Mark Asselstein, the Chief Architect for all things Linux at Wind River.
Hi, everyone.
So thanks everybody for coming. I will just hop right into the first question, which was the subject of much debate before we got here. For the open source contributor, whether commercial or community, what is the biggest challenge to the long-term sustainability of both your project and the open source infrastructure, let's just say? And I'll start with Megan.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So challenges with sustainability, especially for the contributor. It's an interesting perspective to take on sustainability. I think a lot of times we look at it from the commercial side first. So I really like that we're starting with the contributor. With that being said, I think we've all seen that many successful projects are really built up by a very small number of people. And so I think that one of the greatest challenges to sustainability is, no shocker here, maintain our burnout, right? I think the reason we all do this is because we're very passionate about it. We see a need for a solution. We want to deliver that. We get a lot of satisfaction out of that. But with that can also lead to burnout because there's always more. So I will take that perspective. I think that people, bandwidth in general, is probably one of the greatest contributors to sustainability. And in addition, I'll just say money.
Money.
Always money and people.
And people.
Yeah.
Catherine?
I have to agree. So I think about this a lot. I think about the sustainability of open source software more than I should, maybe. I don't know, it gives me anxiety. It runs everything. We cannot exist without open source software. Open source is the way that software is made. I challenge anybody to build something usable or that solves any sort of problem without incorporating some open source software. And yet, there's something, and I'm noticing this more and more, and I'm sure a lot of us in this room notice it. You kind of have the same group of people taking leadership across different projects, across different initiatives. We just don't have enough people contributing to not just the code of the projects, contributing in other ways, contributing documentation, contributing in awareness, the type of stuff we're doing here. And if this goes away tomorrow, what are we gonna do? I mean, this is, again, I harp on this a lot too. The best developer tools are the ones that go unseen. And when they go unseen, and they tend to be a bit underappreciated. And if we don't keep doing the thing to keep these things going, I don't know what happens to all of us because we need it for our phones and our cars and our refrigerators. So.
I'm gonna key in on the long-term part of it, because that's sort of a big part of my life. I think one of the challenges there is where to put things after a project has sort of moved on from the work that they're currently doing. And often projects, so they'll have LTS releases, which will extend 2 or 3 years. But that's often not enough, and we need places to put things in order to collaborate with other organizations in order to make it possible for a project to have both their development stream as well as a sustained stream. So yeah, it's I do a lot of work with the Octo project, and it's great that we have a 4-year LTS. It gives us a place to put patches and changes and fixes, but after that 4 years, there's nowhere to put your work in a collaborative way. So there is discussions right now to extend that, which would be great. But it's not only Octo project. There's other projects that need to have that, that holding place somewhere where we can continue to collaborate on the project after that initial release is out the door, or any of the releases for that project.
Okay. Well, and thinking about in this context of collaborating on projects that either must last a long time or building on ones that have already hit long-term support, as well as the ones that are more rapid, what are some of the challenges that you see around how commercial organizations and the open source community can work together, even though they may have slightly different values? And especially as open source evangelists, thinking of one in particular, how do you overcome that? How do you overcome the potential objections that you would see, especially in a commercial organization?
I'm glad you asked. So I've been asked this before, not too long ago, and I think it's interesting. I think we have an idea, an inflated idea of sort of a conflict between business interests and community interests, and I don't necessarily think that's the case, because at the end of the day, what are we building software for? We're building it to be useful for a purpose. We have a goal in mind. We've built it for a reason, and that reason, if it's valuable and enough for the project to take off, it is probably valuable for a use case. So at the end of the day, the benefit, both groups of people are working essentially toward the same goal. And I don't see that they need to be in conflict. And I think that that's something to solve, is kind of either raising awareness that it doesn't have to be a problem, or just making sure that it's not. Because I have trouble wrapping my head around the idea that it really is a consistent problem. I feel like we've invented that.
I'm going to disagree a little bit.
Okay.
I'm going to disagree.
This is good.
I'm going to
This
take
is
a
what we're
counter.
here for.
I'm going to take a
That's why we're
counterpoint.
here.
Please do.
I'm going to take a counterpoint here, because I do agree in that it doesn't need to be a problem, but I do, because you're right, an open source project that's not being used, especially in commercial interest or in other products, is just code sitting in a repo somewhere, right? It doesn't exist without people using it. You need people to use your project, right? But then it's like it reaches this point of diminishing return where so many people are using the project, and you're hitting that peak of mass users, not enough contributors, and not enough corporate interest yet, right? So that's why setting up your governance is so important, and trying to think about that long-term plan. Even if you think, oh, this is just this little project, I don't expect it to take off, just do that exercise with yourself of like, what could this be in 5 years? Because I think so much of that gets stuck in that top of the funnel, and then you've got your single point of failure with your lead maintainer burning out, or you have a lack of funding and the infrastructure is really struggling, or you need more contributors and more corporate investment, but you haven't been doing enough advocacy for enterprises to really start feeling like they need to contribute, whether it's financially through membership, through code contribution, or others. So I think that I agree, it doesn't need to be there, because open source projects need use cases, and use cases usually come from corporate enterprise, and they can do a lot of good in supporting that. I think it's that feedback loop that needs to get closed there, that once a project hits that point, right, that they're able to start advocating for funding and additional support for contribution.
I want to follow up on that. How do you break through the sort of taking for granted that occurs so much with both enterprises who are using open source without contributing very much, and or developers who just contribute just a tiny bit, but they're really not committed to the future of a project, even though they depend on it?
But it does fail at times.
Yeah.
Look at OpenSSL, right?
I remember well.
So,
Ouch.
yeah, you do have you do have examples
soon,
of
too
that
soon.
for sure. Too soon, no. But yeah, it's there's always a lot of work to go on. There's more than enough. So I think both corporate and open source entities can contribute and advance projects. But yeah, I think you have to make sure that it's not just busy work. It's work that's done to get you somewhere. And I think there's a lot of overlap, as both of you have pointed out, between both interests. And I think that's important to really leverage and to build on in order to keep things going for the long term.
The ubiquity question, though, is one that plagues me as well. Again, we talked earlier, right? Linux is a great example of an incredibly successful project that's a victim of its own success. When something becomes so ubiquitous that you don't even spend that much time thinking about it because you're thinking about the things that you build on top of it. You're excited about some other direction you're going. But you cannot let something that's business critical fall through the cracks. So I don't know the answer. I wish I did know the answer to solving that one because there needs to be an awareness of how important this stuff is because
Yeah.
for obvious reasons.
To me, I feel like this is the exact use case for an OSPO, right? They are looking at your business critical, dependencies, right? Which open source projects, if they went away tomorrow, would hit your bottom line the hardest, and really watching that health of those projects. And if you have an OSPO managing that, then you have an opportunity to have that forward-looking view and say, okay, we have 3 services running on X open source project, and we would lose N billion dollars if they were to stop tomorrow. So we should, unless we're planning on spinning up our own engineering team and doing a fork and managing that forever, we need to start really pushing upstream contribution work. And I think when you look at the risk and the cost there, it's a really nice package for someone who maybe doesn't really care about open source, but really cares about the success of the business.
Threaten them with having to rebuild their own Kubernetes
They do not want to do that.
and maintain it.
Nobody wants to do that. We have a question.
I just wonder if there are any sort of regulations coming out of the EU that might help nudge people in that direction.
Such an interesting question, Mike, and thank you. I'm really glad that you asked it. So I'm sure, as you all are aware, there's this really cool piece of legislation coming out called the Cyber Resilience Act. And at the end of 26, it's going to start taking effect in terms of reporting requirements. What this says is that you're going to have to start really considering as a manufacturer or an open source steward your role in security of your products and maintaining that over a pretty long period of time with pretty harsh fines for not doing your part. And so the standards are still in the works. The main legislative piece is out, but we are talking about how this affects companies and open source projects in general and potentially LTS, right, and users. We talk about this in OpenSSF's Global Cyber Policy Work Group, and it is open to anyone who wants to join or has questions either as a manufacturer, open source project maintainer, or a contributor if they are curious about what their role is here.
Awesome. Thank you for the question.
Shameless plug.
Definitely. I'm curious a little bit more about the cybersecurity impact of that. The fact that not only regulations are requiring in Europe and elsewhere that we be very transparent and report what we're doing, but also, of course, the threats only get worse. And so, as a maintainer, you have to be able to stay ahead of them. Otherwise, your project will fail.
Yes. This is where the mantra that's been floating around my head and many others for the past, hopefully several years, and it's making the secure way the easy way. We have to solve that problem as well because it needs to. Not every developer can be a security expert. I also fundamentally disagree with this idea it does exist. There's a separation in many organizations, right, between the security team and the engineering team, and sometimes there's a bit of a weird tension, which I wish were not true. But at the end of the day, again, you have certain experts, and if we can gather those experts, like in organizations like the OpenSSF, to help empower the developers to make secure software just the default. That is like breathing. Then that's, to me, the way to solve that problem. Now, maybe that's a lofty goal, but I think there are some pretty smart people working toward that goal.
Yeah, but to that point, if you search SE Linux, the #1 search thing that you'll get returned is how to turn it off.
I
So-
am sadly aware of that.
I was not aware. That's pretty funny.
There. There's that tension.
But I've been coming to conferences for I think 5 years since the executive order around SBOM, and I went to an SBOM talk here yesterday, and I think we have to possibly enforce some of these things. Like one of the questions was, is there any tooling around SBOM? So you're producing these SBOMs, how do you consume them? The VEX database, to a certain extent, does some of this, but when you talk about containers, there's you can adjust runC so that it will check a signature to make sure that you don't load a container until the signature is validated. should we be doing the same thing around SBOMs and other certifications before you run software? Is there a way that we could register that and have it checked before it's run? I think in some cases we need to have additional reinforcement in place to force us to consume certifications and be vigilant around them.
Yeah, and then you have to make sure nobody turns it off.
Very, very valid point. Yeah, I to your point about the SBOMs, yeah, I would have to agree with that. And I also think too with the CRA, one of the trickiest parts about this legislation is that you're putting a lot of people in roles that they're not used to playing, right? The developer is not a compliance expert. Compliance experts aren't engineering managers, right? But now they have to learn to speak the same language because compliance is who's looking after, all of the actual finable parts of the CRA, but the developer is on the hook for maintaining the security process, right? So I think it's going to take a lot of education, and I'm hoping that there is some tooling. I know there's some things in the works from some consultancies. I know OpenSSF is working on releasing a couple different tools around consuming SBOMs and making it readable by someone like a compliance expert who isn't going to be able to kind of be in the JSON file, going through all of the bits and bobs in there. So yeah, I hope to see that, and that's kind of one of the goals for the cyber policy work group next year is to really focus more on solutions and tooling. This year was more about education and building that awareness, and hopefully we'll just see more people putting forward that effort.
You have to make people not want to turn them off. That's at the end of the day, that's the solution.
No, the best security, as you say, is there, but it's not in an intrusive way that you want to turn it off.
By default, if you can. So I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about successes that we've achieved with collaboration from commercial and the community, as well as recent examples of cases where commercial entities have been able to help the community succeed in these areas, as we need to do in the future for CRA.
You want to start, Mark?
Yeah, sure. I'm just looking around. There's none of my Ericsson friends here, but probably one of the most exciting successes for me was for the first 6 months or so of 5G being deployed around the world. Every single 5G tower had Wind River Linux, which is based off Yocto project, in the base of the tower. And that was pretty darn cool. Like, you don't get to roll out new cell phone technology every day, and the fact that it was running Linux and pretty much all the towers out there, whether it's our Linux or other Linux, it's amazing to see that. And I'm actually going to squeak in a second one in there. I've been around open source enough that when I started, there was a little bit of a stick it to Microsoft kind of attitude. One of our customers has a large amount of the switching done for Amazon, or for Microsoft Azure, is actually running Linux based off Yocto project. So two sort of success stories there.
I love Microsoft stories from people who've been around open source for a long time. Funny story, I guess I can talk about this now, I don't know. So I was with Linux Journal for many, many years. It was a magazine devoted to the Linux and open source communities. And we would not accept advertising from Microsoft, especially in the beginning. I mean, by the end, Microsoft probably didn't care so much, but at the beginning, they desperately wanted to advertise and spend lots and lots of money. Never accepted it because it would have angered the community so tremendously. My other favorite Microsoft story is when they apologized for Internet Explorer at a DrupalCon in 2010. They
Very
had
nice.
their whole marketing campaign for their booth, stickers and t-shirts. It was apologizing. It was hysterical. Anyway. Microsoft has really kind of come around to open source.
They have. I'll give them full props. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah, I guess one of the examples I have from when I was at Amazon Web Services was trying to figure out how to kind of connect the embedded and edge environments to the cloud, right? Especially for virtualization, for testing, and many things like that. And so, with the Yocto project, I'm the advocacy chair of the project, and kind of got my feet wet in the engineering side. We were kind of thinking, okay, well, what if we created a layer so that our customers that are, wanting to connect their embedded devices to the cloud could just simply put this layer in and it goes. And so we did that, and it's been available for about 4 years now. We have many customers and partners using it as part of their products as well. And so again, a bit back to what Mark was saying about the long tail effort, right? And all where the high tides lift all boats, right? So there might not be a straight line to revenue with that, but the increase in partnerships and relationship building with customers, and honestly just making the cloud more accessible makes this a win.
I think all of these cases are very interesting to me because they're real investments, major investments by commercial entities, but into open source, both to solve a real commercial or real business use case and also to contribute to the future of the project. So talking about the investing, how would you recommend that especially open source developers approach funding these projects when often corporations in particular are facing a lot of budgetary pressure that is, causes these things to get cut?
Sure. All right. So yeah, money's tight, right? I have no idea what you're talking about. It's going great. I think this
It's the economy.
It's definitely the eggs in the economy. I think this goes back to having that OSPO or having that person that's responsible for analyzing that risk, breaking down what that risk and those costs are, and presenting that to the right stakeholders. Knowing what you need to care about, knowing where staff time is going and directing that towards things that have bottom line value for your company, that is going to protect your investment in open source. The second thing to that is to look towards outside funding for those infrastructure critical projects. So for example, with the Yocto project, we were actually able to go through the process with Sovereign Tech Fund 2 years ago. We submitted this really ridiculous application, basically stating why we were so critical to the world. And they were like, yeah, we agree. And so they gave us a big chunk of change to be able to clear the backlog on many different tools that we had that were really critical and set up some new security processes and procedures and things like that. So I don't think without that funding, the project would have been where it is now. Is incredibly important to the success of Yocto Project's future. And I think the only reason we were able to really accomplish that funding was because we had a 5-year plan put together. So again, keeping that forward-looking mindset of like, hey, if I got handed $1 million tomorrow, what would I do with that $1 million? Would I invest that in staffing? Would I invest that in new infrastructure? Would I invest that in features? And kind of having that plan already pre-mapped so that just in case you do happen to get some money, that you are ready to jump on that opportunity.
I would just add as a layer on that, what do you say? Ultimately, it comes down to data, right?
Yeah.
And especially tied to OSPO. I talk to a lot of people. In this industry because of the type of work I do. Very lucky that I get to hear a lot of people's stories. And the most successful OSPOs, in my opinion, are the ones that are really drilling down into that data and really connecting the dots for the higher level leadership to understand very specifically what the ROI is on the work they do. And it can be frustrating for some of us open source nerds to embrace the fact that we have to do that, but we do. We really do need to break it down and communicate not just the savings or the risk, but really the benefit too. There is a tremendous amount of ROI to be had in contributing to the business critical projects that you rely on, but you have to tell that story.
Yeah, and definitely the people equity is an important part, as you point out. Like, if you're just on the sidelines and you're not involved in a project, then you're never really going to get your opinion into that project.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
and
seat at the table.
like and the worst could happen is someone else's opinion, which is 180 degrees from yours, comes into play, and now you're really struggling. Yeah, it's hard for funding. Like I'm fortunate in that. I'm involved in building 2 Linux-based products, and we do have a diverse set of customers that are basically paying for our groups to be able to work in open source. But even there's a challenge to work with our managers so that they have time to do things in open source. It always takes longer to do things in the open than it does in a closed environment. And convincing, continually to have to work to convince folks that it makes sense to allow people to take that extra time is sometimes difficult. But yeah, it's both for ourselves as well as our end customers. I think it's important that they, as you say, recognize that investment and the return that they get on that. I was pretty impressed by the 9 trillion number that was put out at the keynote yesterday. I would like a smaller piece of that, but yeah, like $9 trillion of value coming from open source, and I can almost guarantee that's probably not being paid by everybody that's making use of open source.
Yeah, I'll put that in our business plan, Mark.
Sounds good.
You know, and you help trigger a thought here about maintenance, right? So project maintenance is like not sexy, right? And unfortunately, we've seen in a lot of projects that when enterprise does get involved and they are able to supply, you know, contributors through enterprise, they're mostly concerned with feature development that feeds their products. And what they forget is that the core project still needs to be maintained. And so I think that's one of the most undervalued aspects of contribution, but truly the most important. And I think it gets overlooked a lot. And I wish we could find a way to bring that to the top, because I feel like enterprise struggles to want to pay for, oh, you're just like, oh, these little bugs, like, what do they really mean? You know, you can't put it in like a, you know, a monthly business review of like, oh, we did this thing to deliver this to the customer, right? But ultimately, if the core of the project suffers, your end user does too.
Yeah, and it competes. Like actually, we actually just looked at our numbers, and on Yocto project LTS releases, I think we were doing 1/3 of the sustaining commits in the Yocto project, and the other was about 50%. And yet, I'll still hear from folks within the company saying you need to do more, and it's difficult. And yeah, so right now we're actually, our pendulum's kind of swung towards the sustaining side and not as much on the development side. And we're trying to bring that sort of back into that mode, so we can again bring our opinions and also be more involved in what is often seen as the heavier lifting architectural work before a Yocto project release.
So we're talking a lot about how larger organizations can have, an open source program office, can dedicate teams to sustaining, which, is awesome. Many developers, consumers, contributors to open source, and especially Linux, are individuals, one-person shops in giant companies. I've talked to several people like that just today. And I would ask this team, or this panel rather, what are some best practices? Let's say that you're a one-person shop and you really want to make sure that the project that you work with is sustainable, but you are also the open source program office. How can you lead your company or design your projects in a way that they can have a sustainable future?
Do you want me to go first? All right, second shameless plug. The To-Do Group, another amazing Linux Foundation project. They are the home of all things OSPO, and in the spirit of open source, that's what it is. They have made a set of fabulous tools and templates and things like that you can use to help take in those best practices for that small team. They also have these monthly calls that you can call in and talk to other people that are solo OSPOs or small and mighty OSPOs, and kind of talk about what's plaguing you this month, how to deal with those issues. And I think really building your community of OSPOs outside of your organization is something that has been of value to me. I am of a 2-person OSPO at ARM. It's quite small and very mighty, but it is a lot. And so having some of those best practices already established for me by industry experts and then open sourced, it's just been really helpful to speed up the process.
I love that. The open source way is learning from each other. And that's the purpose of these groups. I would just add, in terms of figuring out a path for a small, maybe single or dual maintainer project within a company, and you are in the OSPO, I think also you have to kind of look at what success looks like, or what sustainability looks like for that project. Do you want additional contributors? Maybe you don't, actually. So I think part of it is even figuring out what that path looks like and what sustainability means for that project, because it's not always the same thing.
Yeah, I also echo that, in that the one nice thing with open source is that everything's out in the open, so you don't have to be secret about it. So being able to find others with same problems is also important. Another part is basically, how do you get started often? When you're by yourself, sometimes you're lacking those resources. So, not being afraid of asking for help, and actually reaching out to people who have been around the community for a long time that might have good advice to give to you. And then maybe one day you'll be able to return that to the next generation.
For sure. And I think also internally, like making sure your web casts far, right? Make friends with DevX, make friends with your engineering teams, make friends with your lawyers, although you're probably already too close with your lawyers. Make friends with all of the departments, because ultimately they all end up feeding back to you, right? And so that is the best advice. If you can have people that you can count on within all of these teams, and maybe even have a round table once every 2 months just to check in on how everything is going, what processes need improvement, et cetera. I found that to be a really great way to kind of help break down those silos.
Oh, succession plan too.
Yeah, succession plan. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. We have about 10 minutes left, and now is a great time for questions from our audience, and I see one dead center.
If that's okay. So going back kind of to the very first question, possibly tying into the one you just talked about maintainer burnout. And I was wondering, has there been any work, maybe in the To-Do group or elsewhere, on kind of using, should we say, modern tools, the two letters you don't name, vibe maintaining? Do you see what I mean?
Vibe maintaining.
Coin that?
Yes. It's a great time for
I learned something new.
Are there tools that we can be using to reduce burnout that we aren't using yet? What research is there into all of that? Is there any?
I believe the most critical tool there is called vacation time.
Can you make more of your vacation time if you have an agent answering bug report? I don't know. Then maybe there's other stuff.
Yeah, no, I suspect you may be correct.
Or is there more automation that you can take advantage of, that especially a small maintainer could take advantage of?
Right. Right.
Not
If
necessarily using those two letters.
you're set up properly, then you do get to occasionally take a vacation.
Yeah, no, I think it actually is an important part, because right now there's a big question about including AI-generated code in open source, but the tooling, that's a separate story, right? Like you can potentially use AI in order to do reviews before anyone actually takes a look at them. Sasha did a great talk on using AI to help the stable kernel maintenance. It's having a side effect that I'm feeling, though, that CVEs have gone way up in the kernel, but that's another story. But yeah, no, I definitely think there's an opportunity for AI there. I would say I'm still an AI neophyte, so I'm still learning myself on where we can use it. But when I am asked about AI, that's the #1 place right now. And I do think there is an opportunity for code generated by AI. How many people have been pulling from Stack Overflow and including that in source code? Is it really that different? I'm torn, because I know that AI is being trained on GPL code that I wrote, and I'm not getting any attribution there. I'm not there for the glory, but I still think it's a little bit questionable. So it's tough. This is a new world, and we'll see how it goes. I'd love to answer that question in a year from now.
It was more the tooling and the meta maintaining process that I was thinking of.
I actually have talked to some people working on tools. Apologies for not remembering the name, but I know there are some tools, and I think the CNCF actually just implemented one of them. But it's the same. It's the same idea. It's like the same as the security conversation, right? Catch the low-hanging fruit, make it easier, and I think that's a big part of it. There are these new tools popping up that can do that low-hanging maintainer fruit to save the maintainer enough time to work on the more interesting problem. So if it can, auto-respond to an issue, or even fix a very simple issue, it's just one layer above, Dependabot or something. But but that is the kind of thing that, I absolutely agree. People should be leaning into tools that are helpful. The Vibe maintainer makes me a little nervous, but I appreciate the sentiment.
I'm trademarking that term.
Yes, I think you should.
That's a good one. I expect to see it on a
Invented
sticker
here
next year.
today.
Question in stage right.
I actually want to build on that, but maybe with another dimension. Because at the same time, I think AI could maybe possibly bring more burnout, more noise, more code.
Always a risk. Yes, unnecessary pull requests. Oh God, another one, right?
But I'm curious if you see that we kind of need to evolve those strategies to continue to make those sustainable, knowing that this is coming at us like pretty big.
yes. The answer to are we going to have to evolve some more is always yes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, actually, after Sasha did his talk about the AI tools for stable kernel maintenance, I ran into him in the hallway and I asked him about, is there a way I can basically turn around those tools in order to see whether our kernel has those critical issues in it or not. It was a perfect, actually it summed up this conversation very well, because his response is you should always just be using the latest kernel. And I basically
Preach,
said,
preach,
yeah, and
preach.
I said, Sasha, that it's great. I know you and Greg have been saying that for years, but it's just not going to happen. You know, like an Ericsson takes 6 months to do evaluation on their product before they can ship it, and we take 6 months to put it into product. So there's a year already gone right there. You know, AGL, for instance, the average age of a car on the street, or the highest age, is about 14 years. So are you going to have a car get updated every year? Probably not. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, the tools there exists an opportunity to come up with those tools, but I do agree that there's an opportunity that's going to burn out people even quicker than they are right now. Do you think there's an opportunity for those tools to be common, like for all these small projects? Are they going to have to come up with their own, or are we going to start seeing some projects that are going to unify this?
That's what I'd like to see. That, you know, really focus on, that's kind of what we're trying to do in OpenSSF with the cyber security stuff, is making these tools that just can hopefully be widely adopted, right? And that also we're getting consensus from industry builders, ecosystem partners, et cetera, so that we can build a successful tool that hopefully has, you know, a multitude of use cases. And then we're all using the same thing, which would just be really nice.
Well, to Catherine's point, that makes it possible to do for the secure thing to be the easy thing, because those tools are easily accessible, or at least they would be in the future.
And hopefully easy to use.
And hopefully easy to use.
And not owned by any big corporations.
And impossible to turn off. Wait, what?
Right. How do I turn it
Sorry,
off?
that's the AI part. The AI comes in and takes over and prevents you from turning it off.
Right. Well, we've got about 4 minutes left. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this session. Any more questions before we have a final round of commentary? All right. Well, I'm going to give the panel the last word. Any last pieces of advice, especially for organizations of any size looking to build a sustainable future for their open source commitments?
I'll go first.
Thanks, Mark.
So those of you that don't know me, I'm definitely heavily leaning towards the Linux embedded side. And the one thing that we're noticing there is that a lot of us are getting a little bit on the older side, I guess. So I guess one of the biggest things for long-term sustainability of open source is to bring in the next generation, making communities welcome to young people, to students. And the AI stuff, unfortunately, is going to make it really difficult. But I think it's important that we continue to welcome new people into the community, and basically set ourselves up for the next 50 years, and for Linux to continue the mission of running the world. You know, I'm nervous. I see Linus getting older. I see a lot of the kernel maintainers getting older, and yeah, I think someone mentioned succession plans. It'll be really interesting over the next 10 years to see how that goes. And hopefully the community does grow with some youth.
Yeah, I agree with you. My final thought just is basically it's up to kind of to all of us really at this event, and to go back to the places where we exist in the real world and communicate the value and communicate the importance of the sustainability of all of these things that we're talking about. Because I think about this too. I think about, you know, I've been around open source for a while. I'm not even, well, I don't count. But back when I was first starting, it was a lot about ideology. We were a bunch of scrappy nerds, and we had a cause, and we were very connected with the open source ideology.
And some of us had hair.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah. So, but increasingly, I feel like I have observed that open source it's become merely a tool. It's a thing that people used to get the job done, and we're a little bit disconnected from that ideology, and that concerns me. Not because you have to go into everything with this, rebellious attitude or whatever it is, but because the more disconnected we become from it, I think the less really viscerally aware we are of the importance of the contribution and the things that factor into that sustainability. So that's, I think, my concern, and I hope that everybody embraces it and takes it back with them.
I would definitely agree with that. Get those data points. Start now. It's not easy. The other thing I would suggest is consider creating some sort of metrics dashboard. As Catherine mentioned, most of us are using open source in every single bit of inner source and also in our products. And inner source can be just as valuable, right? I mean, rebuilding an organizational tools is also something that companies really dislike spending money on, even though we use them every day. So take notice of what you're using, gather those data points, and be ready for those conversations. Document your thoughts on this now so that when those conversations come, you're ready. And really, I would say, put it in the calendar to do it annually. Look at the project health of things that you really depend on and figure out where you can start contributing. And it doesn't have to be code. Our community manager for Yocto project has been in the community for 15 years, and he's never submitted a line of code. And he's probably one of the most well-known people in the project. So just remember, you can make an impact through contribution in a variety of ways. It doesn't always have to be in code. Thank you.
All right, and I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very, very much to our panel. Thank you very much, Megan, Catherine, and Mark. I'm Andrew. We will see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.